7 guns. A girl pinned down on a slab of rock in the middle of a sun-scorched grassland. And on the bench of a freight wagon, an old woman, with gray hair sat still, no screaming, no begging, no blinking. The sun came down white and hard. Dust rose and hung there, because there wasn't any wind. One of them pressed a barrel to the girl's shoulder. Cold steel against warm skin. The old woman still didn't move. Her hands lay folded in her lap. Not shaking. That was the strange part. At her age, in a moment like that, the hands were supposed to shake. The wheels stopped their groaning. The horses stamped, restless. Her eyes weren't on the girl. Her eyes were counting. 6 long guns. 1 shotgun. And an old brand burned into a saddle 10 paces off, a mark a hired wagon driver had no business recognizing. She recognized it. Her fingers tightened, just slightly, on the reins. One of the men laughed. Then a hammer clicked back. There's a kind of stupid that gets a man killed slow. And there's a kind that gets him killed fast. 7 armed riders picked the fast kind on a hot afternoon outside Ironwood Flats. They robbed a wagon. Grabbed a girl. Laughed while they did it. Standard outlaw work. Nothing special. Except they did it in front of an old woman they didn't bother to tie up. Because why would you? She was 65 if she was a day. Gray hair under a flat-brimmed hat. Hands that shook a little when she held the reins too long. A woman men forgot the moment they looked away from her. That was the mistake. Not the robbery. Not the girl. The forgetting. Stay with me here, friend. Pour something warm if the day's been long. This one starts slow, and ends with 7 men learning a lesson the hard way, the only way some men ever learn anything. Now let's go back. Back to the dust, and the heat, and the wagon, that never should have stopped. The trail east of Ironwood Flats ran flat, and pale under a sky the color of an old bruise. Heat came up off the ground in waves you could see, if you looked close. Nobody looked close. Not out here. Out here you kept your eyes on the horizon, and your hand near whatever you carried for protection, and you didn't waste attention on things that didn't move. A freight wagon crawled along that trail. 2 horses pulling it, tired, heads low, ears flat against the sun. Wheels groaning with every turn like they were complaining on principle. Dust rose behind the wheels, and hung there along, while before it settled, because there wasn't hardly any wind to carry it off, just heat, stacking on heat, the whole world gone still, and waiting for something to break it. On the driver's bench sat a woman. Small. Compact. The kind of small that made people assume soft. Gray hair pulled back tight under a hat gone the color of dust, from years of wear. Face lined, not from age alone. From weather. From miles. From things a face doesn't forget even when the mind tries to. Her name was Agnes Calhoun. She was 65 years old, and she looked like exactly what she wanted people to see. A worn-out ranch hand doing worn-out ranch work. Nothing more. Nothing less, either. That part she kept to herself. Beside her, on the same hard bench, sat a young woman. 23 years old. Eleanor Vance. Dark hair pinned up under a bonnet that had lost its shape somewhere around noon. A leather satchel sat in her lap. She checked it. Again. 3rd time in an hour. Agnes noticed. Agnes noticed everything. That was the thing about her nobody understood yet. Small details didn't slip past Agnes Calhoun. They never had. The satchel wasn't the whole secret, though. Agnes knew that too. She just didn't say it. Not yet. You keep touching that bag, Agnes said. Voice low. Gravel under the words. Like it's gonna walk off on its own. Eleanor's hand froze on the strap. Habit. Bad one. Out here. Agnes didn't look at her when she said it. Eyes on the road. Always on the road. Habits get noticed. By who? Agnes didn't answer that. Because there was nobody to notice. Not yet. Just heat, and dust, and the long empty stretch toward Laramie, and a wagon wheel that had started squeaking somewhere around mile 11 and hadn't stopped since. Except Agnes had already seen it. A smudge on the horizon. Small. Rising slow. Not wind. Not natural. She didn't say anything. Not right away. Just watched it grow, while the wagon rolled on, wheels groaning, horses tired, Eleanor still fussing, with a strap she didn't need to fuss with. Old women weren't supposed to notice dust clouds 3 miles off, and know, right down in the gut, what they meant. Agnes wasn't supposed to know a lot of things. She knew them anyway. There was a rhythm to trouble, if a person paid attention long enough to learn it. First the dust. Then the shapes inside the dust, riders moving with purpose instead of drift. Then the silence, that fell over open country right before something loud happened in it. Agnes had learned that rhythm a long time ago, in places she didn't talk about, and some lessons a body simply never unlearned no matter how many years it spent trying. She let the reins go a little slack. Not much. Just enough that her hands sat looser, ready, the way a person's hands sit, when they've spent a lifetime pretending they don't know how to be dangerous. Eleanor caught the shift. Frowned. Something wrong? Not yet, Agnes said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. The dust became shapes. Shapes became riders. 6 of them coming off a low ridge like they'd grown out of the ground itself. A 7th slid out of the brush to the left, quiet, patient, like he'd been waiting there since morning. Which, Agnes figured, he probably had. The wagon rolled to a stop on its own. Horses knew trouble before people did, sometimes. Smart animals. Eleanor's breath caught. Small sound. Involuntary. Don't, Agnes said. Quiet. Don't what? Don't let them see it on your face. Whatever you're scared of losing. Agnes's hand stayed loose on the reins. Loose. Easy. Like this happened every Tuesday. They read faces before they read anything else. Eleanor swallowed. Nodded once. Didn't trust her voice. The riders spread wide across the trail, smooth, practiced, no wasted motion. That told Agnes something important, before a single word got spoken. Amateurs bunched up. Amateurs shouted too soon, and shot too fast, and stepped on each other's boots. These men didn't bunch up. Which meant this wasn't their first time doing this. Which meant Agnes needed to think faster than she was letting on. A man broke off from the group and rode forward alone. Broad through the shoulders. Hard around the jaw. The kind of face built for smiling at things that weren't funny. His name was Dutch Malloy, though Eleanor didn't know that yet, and Agnes knew it the second she looked at him, and felt something cold turn over in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. Old and buried, and unwelcome, though she couldn't yet say why. Something about the set of his eyes. Something about the way he sat a horse like he'd learned it, from somebody who'd learned it, from somebody else, a lineage of habits passed down, without a name attached. She pushed the feeling down. There wasn't time for it now. Afternoon, Dutch called out. Friendly voice. Wrong kind of friendly. Agnes said nothing. Dutch smiled wider. Ma'am's got manners. Girl, you got manners? Eleanor's chin lifted. Depends who's asking. A couple of the riders laughed. Ugly sound, low, like dogs before a fight. We just need a few answers, Dutch said, easing his horse closer. Won't take long. What do you want? Eleanor's voice cracked despite her best effort to keep it still. Dutch's eyes drifted to the satchel. Depends what you're carrying. They didn't ask twice. Hands grabbed the horses. A man swung up, onto the rear axle like he'd done it 100 times. Crates got wrenched open. Blankets thrown into the dirt. Supplies scattered like a child's tantrum, except cold, except deliberate, except every man doing it knew exactly what he was hunting for. One of the younger riders, a lanky boy, who couldn't have been past 19, sunburnt across the nose, hat 2 sizes too big, kept glancing at Agnes the whole time he worked. Kept expecting her to do something. Scream. Beg. Reach for a weapon that wasn't there. When she did none of it, when she just sat there on the bench watching the whole search unfold, with an expression like she was waiting on a kettle to boil, he lost interest fast, and went back to his rummaging. That was fine by her. That was exactly what she wanted. They found the satchel fast. Eleanor's face barely moved. A flicker. A held breath. Agnes caught it. Of course she caught it. She caught everything. Dutch opened the satchel himself. Pulled out a sealed leather envelope. Turned it over in his hands like a man weighing gold. Satisfaction flashed across his face. Then it disappeared. Because he looked at Eleanor again, and something in her stillness told him more than the envelope had. That's not all of it. Is it? Not a question. A statement dressed up like one. Eleanor said nothing. Silence answered for her. Loud as a shout. They dragged her off the wagon. She fought it. Small fists, useless against grown men's grips, but she fought it anyway, and something in Agnes's chest twisted watching a girl fight a battle she couldn't win, because giving up wasn't in her, not yet, maybe not ever. 2 men hauled her toward a flat slab of rock rising out of the grass like a stage built for exactly this kind of cruelty. The sun stayed high. Indifferent. It always did. One bandit shoved Eleanor down onto the rock. Another pressed a revolver to her shoulder. Cold steel. Warm skin. The kind of contrast a person doesn't forget for a long time after. And still. The old woman on the wagon didn't move. Eleanor looked back at her. Just once. Disappointment crossed her face. Sharp. Sudden. Because she'd trusted this stranger for 2 days on the road, and now, when it mattered, the woman just sat there. Hands in her lap. Eyes down. Weak, Eleanor thought. God help me, I trusted a weak old woman. She didn't know. Couldn't know. That the woman doing nothing was doing everything. Watching. Counting. Measuring 7 armed men down to their boots, and their reflexes, and the particular way each one's trigger finger sat against the metal. Because here's the thing about Agnes Calhoun, that Eleanor Vance hadn't figured out yet, and Dutch Malloy hadn't figured out at all. Saving someone and rescuing them right this second aren't always the same job. Sometimes the first one means waiting. Waiting is the hardest kind of brave there is. While every eye in that clearing stayed locked on Eleanor, Agnes did her work. Quiet work. Invisible work. She counted rifles. 6 long guns, 1 shotgun, more revolvers than she cared to number exactly. She watched hands, which ones stayed loose, which ones gripped too tight, which men were nervous underneath the swagger. Nervous men made mistakes. Mistakes kept people alive, if you were patient enough to wait for them. She marked the young sunburnt boy, as the weak link. Marked a heavier man near the wagon, quiet, watchful, as the one worth worrying about most. Marked Dutch himself, as neither the strongest, nor the fastest of the seven, just the one the others deferred to, which was a different kind of dangerous. Followers turned unpredictable fast once a leader's authority cracked. Then her eyes found something small. A brand. Burned into the leather of a saddle not 10 feet from her. Faded some, but not faded enough to hide the shape. Agnes had seen that mark before. Not on outlaws. Not on drifters. On cattle. On fences. On the gate of a ranch big enough to swallow 3 counties whole, owned by a man, whose name still tasted like copper in Agnes's mouth even, after all the years she'd spent trying to forget it. Warwick Ash Grove. Something cold settled into her stomach, and stayed there. Because this wasn't a robbery. This was an errand. And errands ordered by men like Ashgrove didn't end with a satchel changing hands. They ended with bodies nobody bothered looking for. Agnes kept her hands still. Kept her face slack. Kept every scrap of what she was thinking locked down tight behind a lifetime of practice at looking like nothing at all. Because if Dutch Malloy knew what she just figured out, if he so much as suspected, this got a great deal worse for everyone. Starting with the girl on the rock, and ending, probably, with a shallow hole nobody would find, until the coyotes did. So Agnes waited. And watched. And said nothing. Inside her own skull, though, something was moving fast. That's Ashgrove's mark. That's Ashgrove's mark on that saddle. Except it can't be. Except it is. I know that brand better than I know my own hands. So this isn't 7 men chasing an easy payday. This is a job. Somebody sent them. Which means the girl's satchel isn't the whole story. Which means whatever she's carrying, somebody powerful wants it badly enough to send armed riders after a public wagon in broad daylight. And that means I need to move slower than every instinct in my body is telling me to. She swallowed the thought whole, and let her face go blank again, the way a person shuts a door on a room they don't have time to clean. They put Eleanor on a horse. Bound loose, hands in front, more for show than for holding, 7 armed men figured a girl her size wasn't going anywhere on foot or otherwise. The gang turned west, off the main trail, toward country that didn't show up on maps folks trusted. Agnes rode with them. Nobody tied her hands. They took her revolver, an old thing, worn smooth at the grip, and one of them made a joke about it, that got a round of laughs Agnes didn't react to. They checked her pockets. One man even pulled off her boot, and shook it out, expecting a knife, or a coin purse, or something worth the trouble. Found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. Not on her person, anyway. What Agnes carried didn't live in her boots. It lived somewhere men like these never thought to look, behind tired eyes, under gray hair, inside a body that had spent decades convincing the world it belonged to a harmless old ranch hand, and nobody else. Dutch didn't order her tied. Didn't see the point. 7 armed men, 1 worn-out grandmother, where exactly did the math go wrong for him? It didn't, not that he could see. That was his first mistake, and he wouldn't understand it was a mistake for hours yet. Agnes rode in silence, studying. Weapons. Horses. Tack. The particular slouch of the youngest rider's shoulders, the too quick way the man beside him reached for his canteen every few minutes, nervous habit, maybe, or thirst, or both. Every group made mistakes eventually. The trick was staying alive long enough to see them happen. She'd stayed alive a very long time. The country changed as they rode. Grass gave way to scrub, scrub gave way to broken rock, and the trail, if you could call it that anymore, wound down, through a shallow draw, where the heat pooled thick, and stubborn, unwilling to move even, as the afternoon aged toward evening. Eleanor rode a few horses ahead, spine stiff, eyes forward. She hadn't looked back once since the rock. Agnes understood why. A person only had, so much room in them for looking at somebody who'd let them down. Better to spend that room on staying upright in the saddle. By late afternoon they reached a lined shack sitting alone near a shallow creek. Weathered wood, gone silver-gray with years of sun. A broken-down corral off to one side. A water trough, with more rust than trough left in it. The kind of place the world forgot existed. Which was exactly why Dutch liked it. They pushed Eleanor inside. Left Agnes near the corral, close enough to the horses, that if she'd wanted to run, she could have tried. Didn't try. Just stood there, hands loose at her sides, watching everything and looking like she was watching nothing. One of the younger bandits pulled a rifle from the wagon bed. Old Winchester, wood stock scarred and worn. He held it up, laughing. "Look at this thing. My grandpappy's got younger guns than this." Laughter rippled through the camp. Even Dutch cracked a grin. Nobody noticed Agnes didn't smile. Nobody noticed the rifle had been cleaned recently. Oiled. Cared for. The kind of maintenance a man gives a tool he trusts his life to, not the kind a wagon driver gives to something she never fires. Small detail. Everybody missed it. That was how these things went, Agnes had learned. Men saw an old woman and an old gun, and assumed both were finished. Assumed wrong, plenty of times, but assumed it anyway, because assuming was easier than looking close. The bandit tossed the rifle carelessly against a crate near the wagon, and moved on to other business, and Agnes marked its exact position in her mind the way another person might mark the exit of a burning building. Inside the shack, Dutch went to work on Eleanor. He wanted names. Documents. Proof, real proof, something with signatures on it, something that would matter to a man like Warwick Ash Grove. Eleanor gave him nothing. "Where's the rest of it?" Dutch said. Third time asking. Patience thinning at the edges like cheap rope. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." He crouched in front of her, elbows on his knees, voice gone soft in a way that was worse than shouting. "The envelope wasn't the whole thing. I could see it on you back on that rock. You're hiding something else." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Then I guess you'll have to keep wondering." It sounded braver than it felt. She could hear her own pulse in her ears. Could feel her hands shaking, where they sat folded in her lap, and she hated that her body wouldn't hold still even when her voice managed to. Standing up to armed men, that's easy in stories. In real life, it's a different animal entirely. In real life it's cold sweat, and a dry mouth, and the terrible knowledge that nobody's coming. Especially when the one person who might help just stood outside by the corral, doing nothing. Eleanor didn't know yet how wrong that thought was. Dutch stood. Paced the small room once, twice, boots loud on the warped floorboards. "You know what I think," he said. "I think a girl doesn't sow fear into her own face over a bank draft. I think whatever's in that coat of yours is worth more than money to you." Eleanor said nothing. "That's fine," Dutch said. "I've got time." He didn't. Not really. Not as much as he thought he did. But Eleanor didn't know that yet either. He left her there, posted a young bandit outside the door, the sunburnt one, still looking faintly embarrassed about the joke, over the old rifle, and stepped back out, into the yard, where the light had started going long and gold across the grass. Near sunset, a bandit walked into the shack carrying Eleanor's coat. Just to search it. Routine, the way everything else had been routine that day. But something happened on Eleanor's face the moment she saw it in his hands. A flicker. Half a second. No more. Agnes caught it, through the open doorway, same as she caught everything. Filed it away next to the brand on the saddle, and the too-clean rifle, and the 7 names she was already starting to sort by how dangerous each man actually was. That coat mattered. Mattered enough that Eleanor's whole body had gone rigid watching a stranger hold it. Agnes didn't know what was sewn into the lining yet. But she knew there was something. And she knew, with the kind of certainty that had kept her breathing for 6.5 decades, that whatever it was, Dutch Malloy hadn't found it yet. Small mercies. She'd take them. An hour later, a rider came in, from the direction of Ironwood Flats. Dust-covered, horse-lathered, carrying a folded message, that he handed straight to Dutch without dismounting. The conversation was short. Agnes heard enough of it anyway. Standing near enough, looking like she was fussing, with a strap on the corral fence, ears doing work her hands weren't. She heard Ashgrove's name. Heard something about a ranch. Heard the words bring the girl direct, and something in her chest went very still, and very cold. Whatever Eleanor Vance was carrying, Warwick Ash Grove wanted it badly enough to send riders after it. Badly enough to risk a kidnapping in broad daylight on a public trail, which wasn't the kind of risk a careful man took, over money alone. This was something else. Something that scared him. And men like Ashgrove didn't scare easy. Agnes knew that better than almost anyone alive, because she'd been the one thing in this territory that had once made his family sweat, right up until the night it stopped mattering whether they sweated or not. She didn't let herself finish that thought. Not here. Not now. Old ground. Old graves. Leave them buried. As the light went gold, then gray, then gone, the camp settled the way camps do. A fire got built. Bottles got passed. Voices loosened up the way voices do, when men start believing the dangers behind them for the day. Old outlaws made the same mistake young cowboys did. They got comfortable. One of the men, young, maybe not even 20, with a face that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to grow a beard, started telling a story about a gunfighter. "You ever hear of the Silver Ghost?" he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Fella up around Sweetwater Way. Story goes he stopped. Corrected himself with a laugh. Nah, he faced down a whole gang single-handed. Killed 6 of them before breakfast. I heard it was 10, another man said. I heard it was more'n that, said a third, already 3 drinks past sober. I heard the ghost don't miss. Ever. Not once. My uncle swore he saw the ghost outdraw 3 men at once outside a saloon in Casper, the sunburnt boy offered, eager to have something to add. Said the ghost's hand moved, so fast nobody even saw the gun clear leather. Just saw 3 men drop. The number kept climbing, with every bottle that got passed around the fire, the way legends always do, growing fat and impossible the further they traveled, from whatever thin scrap of truth had started them. Agnes sat near the edge of the firelight and listened. Said nothing. Face unreadable. From inside the shack, Eleanor's voice carried out, into the dark. Sounds like a tall tale. The men laughed. Maybe, one of them shouted back. Eleanor almost smiled despite everything. Most legends are. Agnes looked into the fire. And, for just a second, just one, something like a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Because the girl wasn't entirely wrong. The West had a habit of turning ordinary people into legends. Then turning legends, into monsters, or into jokes, or into ghost stories told by drunk men around a fire, who had no earthly idea the ghost in question was sitting 8 feet away from them, listening, and old, and tired, and very much alive. The truth, Agnes thought, usually sat somewhere in the middle. Closer to the middle than any of these men would ever believe. 6 before breakfast. If only they knew how much worse the truth was some mornings. If only they knew how much lighter the lie sounds. Except lies are easier to carry. That's the whole trouble with them. Lies don't weigh anything at all, and truth weighs about as much as a body does. So let them keep telling it wrong. Let the number climb. It's safer that way. For everybody. Including me. The fire burned lower. Bottles emptied. Laughter thinned out, and died the way laughter does, when a long day finally catches up to tired men. 2 guards stayed up. The rest bedded down in the dirt, wrapped in blankets, snoring within minutes. Agnes leaned back against a fence post. To anyone watching, she looked half asleep already. Head tipped forward. Hat brim low. Her mind wasn't sleeping. Her mind was running numbers. 7 men. 1 rifle taken from her wagon, and now leaned carelessly against a crate 10 feet away. 2 guards, 1 alert, pacing, checking the dark like it might bite him. The other one drifting, again and again, toward a whiskey bottle he had no business finishing. Because, and here was the thing that mattered most. Because Eleanor wasn't protecting money. Because she wasn't protecting some family secret worth a few dollars, and an afternoon's embarrassment. Because whatever was sewn into that coat was worth more to her than her own safety. Agnes had seen that kind of fear before. Seen it in mothers. Seen it in soldiers. Seen it, once, in her own reflection, a very long time ago, back when she still had a different name, and a reputation men whispered about instead of laughed about. That changed everything. Which meant Agnes had a decision to make. And she made it. Before sunrise, she was getting that girl out of this camp. Whatever it cost. Whatever old ghosts it woke up along the way. She didn't know, yet how close, that decision had come, how close, right that very minute, inside the dark little shack 10 feet away, everything was about to change. Because inside the shack, Dutch Malloy had picked up Eleanor's coat again. Not to search it this time. Just to move it off the bench, where it sat, so he could stretch his legs out, and rest before his watch. His fingers brushed something stiff along the seam. Something that didn't belong in a coat lining. He stopped. Went still. Ran his thumb along the hem again, slower this time, and felt it clearly now, paper. Folded thin and hard, stitched carefully into the lining by hands that had clearly done this before, hands that knew exactly how much a life could depend on a hidden seam. Dutch's stomach dropped. He drew his knife. Slit the stitching in 3 careful strokes. Papers slid free, into his palm, and he unfolded them by the low light of a single lamp, reading slow, reading twice, because the first time, through didn't seem possible. Land records. Names. Dates. Signatures, Warwick Ash Grove signature, right there in black ink, next to a dozen others belonging to ranchers Dutch had grown up hearing about. Small operations. Family spreads. Places that had, one after another, over the last few years, gone bankrupt, burned down, or simply disappeared, from the county rolls. All of it, laid out plain, as daylight, in Eleanor Vance's handwriting notes stitched right alongside the official papers. Proof. Not rumor. Not gossip passed over a fence line. Proof that Warwick Ash Grove had been stealing land, from smaller ranchers for years, quietly, patiently, one ruined family at a time, and dressing every bit of it up, as legal business. Dutch stared at the papers for a long moment. Then, slowly, he folded them back up. Tucked them into his own coat instead of hers. Because he wanted Ash Grove to see this, with his own eyes. Wanted to watch his employer's face, when he understood exactly what his hired girl had been carrying across the territory. Except something else was happening on Dutch's face now, something the firelight outside couldn't see, and Agnes, from her spot by the fence, could only guess at. The lazy confidence he'd worn all day, gone. Just gone. In its place, worry. Real worry. The kind that lives underneath a man's ribs, and doesn't leave once it's settled in. Because men like Dutch Malloy weren't scared of much. If these papers scared him. If a folded stack of land deeds could put that particular look on a hardened outlaw's face. Then somebody bigger, somebody worse, was standing behind all of it. And Dutch had just realized he was standing on the wrong side of that somebody's business. He stormed out of the shack a few minutes later. Barked orders. Woke every man in camp, with a voice gone hard, and fast in a way it hadn't been all day. The drinking stopped. The laughing stopped. Even the sleepy guard sat up straight, blinking, reaching automatically for his rifle, without quite knowing why yet. Agnes watched it all, from her spot by the fence, and understood, with a cold certainty settling low in her chest, exactly what it meant. The window was closing. If she waited any longer, if she let this night run its course the slow, careful way she'd planned, Eleanor Vance would be gone by morning. Taken to a ranch house Agnes remembered too well, handed over to a man, whose name still sat in her mouth like something rotten. Maybe gone forever. The fire crackled low, throwing long shadows across 7 armed men who'd just woken up to a danger far bigger than the one they'd started the day chasing. And an old woman by a fence post, who they'd forgotten to tie up, who they'd forgotten to fear, who they'd forgotten entirely. Began, very quietly, to move. Every gunfighter Agnes Calhoun had ever known, good ones, bad ones, ones who died young, and ones who lived long enough to regret it, every single one of them believed the same lie. They believed speed won fights. It didn't. Patience won fights. Speed just finished them. She thought about that while she pushed off the fence post. Slow. Silent. No sudden movement, because sudden movement was what tired eyes caught even when tired eyes caught nothing else. One guard drifted toward the tree line. Nature calling, the way it always did around this hour. The other guard stayed put. Whiskey called louder than duty. It usually did. Agnes crossed the dark in 4 steps, that made no sound at all. The guard never turned. Never even flinched. Because he never saw it coming. One moment he stood there, staring at nothing, bottle loose in his fingers. The next moment the ground came up fast, and Agnes caught him halfway down, easing him into the dirt, without so much as a grunt escaping either one of them. No noise. No gunfire. Not yet. She pulled the cabin key from his belt. Crossed the yard low, and quick, past the dying fire, past sleeping men, who didn't know how close they'd just come to losing everything, and slid the key into the lock, with hands that had gone perfectly, terrifyingly steady. The door swung open. Eleanor looked up. Fast. Startled. For the first time all day, something other than fear crossed her face. Surprise. You came back. Agnes almost smiled. I was always here. Even now. Even scared half out of her mind, and running on nothing but nerve and old, buried instinct. That line pulled something loose in Eleanor's chest. Almost a laugh. Almost. They moved fast after that. No time for anything else. The horses, Agnes whispered, already turning toward the corral. Eleanor's eyes darted back toward the shack. Toward the bench, where her coat had been sitting an hour ago. The coat. 2 words. That was all she managed. Agnes didn't argue. Didn't ask why. She already knew, had known, since the flicker crossed Eleanor's face back, when a stranger's hands first touched that fabric. She slid back into the shack. Grabbed the coat off the floor, where Dutch had tossed it, after cutting the seam open. Out again in under 10 seconds. Now we ride. 2 words back. Even trade. And for one perfect, impossible moment, it looked like it was going to work. Like all of it, the waiting, the watching, the counting of rifles, and reading of faces, was about to pay off clean. Except one sleepy bandit near the fire chose, that exact second to wake up. blinked twice, looked straight at them, and screamed. The whole camp exploded at once. Men came up out of bedrolls like the ground itself had thrown them. Boots hit dirt in every direction. A lantern went over, glass shattering, and somewhere in the chaos a man was shouting for his rifle in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence. "Run." That was all Agnes said. All she needed to say. Eleanor didn't wait to be told twice. They sprinted for the corral together, boots pounding dirt, breath ragged, and behind them Dutch Malloy's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Stop them." A shot cracked the night open. Then another. Neither one came close. Because panicked men, with good aim in daylight became something else entirely in the dark, firing at shapes, and shadows, and the memory of, where a target used to be standing. Agnes had learned that lesson a long time ago, in a different camp, under a different sky, and it hadn't stopped being true since. They reached the horses. Eleanor swung up first, hands shaking so hard she nearly missed the stirrup, and made it anyway on the second try. Agnes didn't reach for a horse. She reached for the wagon. For the old Winchester leaned carelessly against a crate, the same rifle a boy had held up laughing, that afternoon, comparing it, unfavorably, to his grandfather's guns. Funny how fast opinions changed. A lantern still burned near the shack, swinging on its hook, throwing wild light across the whole scrambling camp. Agnes raised the rifle. Didn't think about it. Just moved, the way her body remembered moving even, when her mind had spent years trying to forget how. One shot. Glass exploded across the yard. A second shot followed half a heartbeat later, and a rifle flew clean out of a bandit's hands like something had ripped it away from him. Nobody had seen her aim. Nobody had seen her move at all. For one full second, one long, suspended, terrible second, every man in that camp simply stood there and stared. Because the old woman near the wagon didn't look old anymore. She looked like something else entirely. Something the fire's fading light couldn't quite explain, something that made the youngest bandit's stomach drop clean through the ground, though he couldn't have said why, if you'd asked him. Darkness swallowed the rest of the camp, before anyone recovered. Horses screamed and pulled against their tethers. Men shouted over each other, over the gunfire, over their own rising panic, and nobody, not one single man among the 7, could say for certain where anybody else stood. Confusion did more damage in those 10 seconds than every bullet fired combined. That was exactly what Agnes wanted. They rode hard, into the open dark, the shack and the shouting, and the scattered gunfire falling away behind them mile by mile. Night air came in cool against Eleanor's face, a sharp relief, after the smothering heat of the day, and for the first time, since a dust cloud had first risen on the eastern horizon. She let herself believe they might actually make it. Might. Then something happened that neither one of them expected. One of the pursuing riders slowed. Then stopped completely. The rest of the gang thundered past him, shouting, chasing shadows that had already outrun them, and the lone rider just sat there in his saddle, motionless, staring after Agnes like he'd seen something rise up out of the ground itself. Because he had, in a way. His face went pale even in the dark. Even at that distance. He wasn't looking at a wagon driver anymore. He was looking at a ghost he'd been certain, for years, had died a long time ago. His name was Amos Teller, though Agnes didn't say it, and Eleanor never learned it at all. A ranch hand once, young, scared, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time long before this night, back when a different family had needed protecting, and hadn't gotten it in time. Agnes had been there that night too. Hadn't been able to save everyone. Had, in the end, chosen to spare the frightened boy who'd been sent along, with older, harder men to do a job he clearly hadn't wanted any part of, rather than treat him the same as the ones who had. He'd grown up since. Grown hard, or hard enough to ride, with men like Dutch Malloy for a wage. But some things a person doesn't grow out of. Some faces stay burned into a memory whether a person wants them there or not. He never raised his rifle. Just sat there, watching, until finally he turned his horse around, slow, deliberate, and rode back, into the darkness the way he'd come, and something in the set of his shoulders looked, even from a distance, like a man carrying a debt he had no idea how to repay. Eleanor glanced back, breathless. What was that? Old memories, Agnes said. Which wasn't a lie. Just wasn't the whole truth, either. The ride ran on, until the sky began to pale along the eastern rim of the world, gray creeping into black the way it always did, slow and then all at once. Neither one of them had much left by then. Horses blowing hard, sides heaving. Eleanor slumped forward, exhausted past the point of fear. Even Agnes, who hadn't felt this kind of bone-deep tired in longer than she could remember, showed it now, in the set of her shoulders, in the way her hands sat heavier on the reins than they had the day before. They stopped beside a shallow creek, as the sun climbed the horizon. Eleanor slid down off her horse, and sat hard on a flat rock near the water. For a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Just the sound of the creek running low, over stones, and two tired horses drinking, and somewhere off in the brush a bird starting up its morning noise like nothing in the world had happened. Then Eleanor looked at her. Really looked. Not at a wagon driver anymore. Not at some harmless old woman hired for 2 days' work, and a handful of coins. At something else. You've done this before. Half of her admired it. The other half, the more careful half, wasn't sure, yet whether admiration was the safe response. Agnes almost laughed. Done what? Escaped armed men. That. A small, tired smile pulled at the corner of Agnes's mouth. More than once. Eleanor studied her face in the pale morning light. 100 questions sat right behind her teeth, crowding to get out, and most of them could wait. One couldn't. Who are you? Really? Agnes took a long pull from her canteen. Looked out toward the sunrise instead of at the girl beside her. The answer didn't come. Not because she wanted to seem mysterious. Not some game, not some performance. Because she genuinely didn't know how to answer it anymore. Hadn't known in years. A woman could ride a long, long way trying to outrun who she used to be. Sometimes she still couldn't outrun herself. Inside her own head, something ugly kept turning, over and over, the way it always did in the quiet after violence. Don't tell her. Don't you dare tell her. Except she deserves to know. Except knowing gets people killed. Knowing got people killed before. Which was a long time ago. Which is not now. So why does it still feel like it's happening again? She didn't say any of that out loud. Just capped the canteen, and let the silence sit there between them, heavy and unresolved, the way silence tends to do, when the truth is too big to hand somebody all at once. Eleanor didn't push. Not yet. She'd learn, before this was over, that not pushing was sometimes the wisest thing a person could do around Agnes Calhoun. They rested a while longer by the creek. Eleanor pulled off her boots, and let her bare feet sit in the cold water, wincing, then sighing, then finally letting her shoulders drop for the first time, since the wagon had stopped rolling the day before. I should thank you, she said eventually. Properly, I mean. Not just, running, and gasping, and forgetting my manners. You've had a rough day, Agnes said. Manners can wait. Still. Eleanor watched the water move, over her toes. You didn't have to come back for the coat. You wanted it bad enough. I figured it was worth the 10 seconds. It was worth more than that. Agnes glanced sideways at her. Said nothing, but the look asked the question plain enough. Eleanor hesitated. Then shook her head. Not yet. I will tell you. Just, not yet. It's easier to carry a secret than to watch somebody's face change once they know it. Fair enough, Agnes said. I've got secrets of my own I'm not in a hurry to hand over either. Something like understanding passed between them then, quiet, wordless, two people carrying weight they weren't ready to set down in front of each other just yet, but willing, for now, to let the other keep carrying theirs in peace. By mid-morning, the outline of Ironwood Flats rose up out of the flat land ahead of them, rooftops, a church steeple, smoke curling up, from a dozen chimneys, the whole ordinary sleepy shape of a town, that had no idea what had ridden into its morning. Eleanor's shoulders dropped, with relief at the sight of it. We made it. No. Agnes kept her eyes fixed on the buildings ahead, on the sheriff's office in particular, on a horse tied outside it, that had gone very, very still in her attention. I don't think we have. What? Because there it was. A horse. Familiar. Same brand Agnes had seen burned into leather less than a day earlier, back at a line shack, that was probably still smoldering, with confusion and gunpowder smoke. Not a coincidence. Out here, coincidences existed. Just not that many. Not stacked one on top of another the way this one sat. Agnes pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of town, and something cold settled into her chest, the same cold that had settled there the moment she'd first spotted a ranch brand on a bandit saddle a day earlier. Eleanor looked confused, exhausted, hopeful despite everything. Agnes. We made it. Wait. A man stepped out, onto the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office. Badge catching the morning light. He exchanged a few words with the rider, whose horse sat tied outside, and both men laughed together, easy, familiar, the kind of laugh that only passed between men who trusted each other. Agnes recognized the second man immediately. She'd seen him at the ranch once, years back, standing behind Ash Grove's shoulder like a shadow that had learned to walk on its own. Eleanor followed her gaze. Watched the color drain slowly out of her own face, as understanding crept in, inch by terrible inch. Because the sheriff wasn't standing there waiting to help them. The sheriff was standing there waiting for them to arrive. That's, Eleanor's voice caught. That's one of Ash Grove's men. Yes. And the sheriff's just talking to him. Laughing with him. Yes. Eleanor's hands curled into fists in her lap. Something in her, something, that had survived a kidnapping, a night in a line shack, a desperate ride, through the dark, cracked just a little at this. Not the fear of armed men in the open country. The quieter, colder fear of discovering the law itself wasn't on your side. A badge doesn't always mean justice. That was a lesson a lot of frontier families learned. Usually too late to do them any good. And then Agnes saw the poster. Fresh paper, nailed up near the edge of town, ink still dark enough to catch the morning light. She nudged her horse closer. Read a few lines. Her jaw tightened. Because somewhere in the last 12 hours, while she'd been riding, through the dark, with a girl she barely knew, dodging gunfire, watching a frightened ranch hand turn tail, and run. Somebody had turned her into the villain of this story. The poster claimed Agnes Calhoun had kidnapped Eleanor Vance. Reward offered. Description accurate enough to be dangerous. And underneath it, in smaller print, a warning that the woman in question was believed armed, and dangerous, wanted for questioning in connection to a killing near Sweetwater a good many years back. So somebody remembers. Somebody besides me. Which means somebody's been keeping records. Waiting for a reason to use them. Eleanor read it, over her shoulder, and went very still. They're calling you a kidnapper. Half this town probably already believes it, Agnes said, low. That's insane. You saved me. Doesn't matter what's true. Agnes turned her horse away, from the poster, away from the sheriff's office, away from the laughing men on the boardwalk. Matters what people are told first. Lies get a head start. Truth's always playing catch-up. They didn't ride straight into town. Couldn't. Not with a poster like that hanging where any fool with eyes could read it, not with a sheriff already standing on the wrong side of this whole mess. Agnes led them around the edge of Ironwood Flats instead, along the back lots and empty lanes, toward an old stable near the railroad tracks that had seen better decades. The smell hit first: hay, dust, hard years pressed into old wood. They stepped inside, horses left tied loose outside, where nobody would think twice about seeing them. For a moment, neither Agnes nor Eleanor spoke. Then a voice broke the silence, from somewhere deeper in the shadows. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." Agnes's whole body went rigid. Because she knew that voice. Knew it the way a person knows thunder, before the sound of it even finishes rolling in. A man stepped out of the shadows near the back stalls. Older now. Grayer. But carrying himself, with the same steady, unhurried presence she remembered, from years past, back when both of them had been considerably younger, and considerably more reckless. Deputy U.S. Marshal Thaddeus Rourke. The two of them stood there a moment, just looking at each other, and something passed between them, that didn't need words. Trouble had found Agnes Calhoun again. Rourke's eyes flicked to Eleanor. Back to Agnes. "You want to explain why half of Ash Grove's payroll is riding, through my jurisdiction, with a wanted poster bearing your name. Would if I could make sense of it myself. Try me anyway. He's here. Which means either he already knows something. Or he's exactly the wrong man to be standing in front of right now. Except that's not the Rourke I remember. Long time is a long time, though. Long enough to change a man. Long enough for a badge to mean something different than it used to." Agnes kept her hand loose near her hip. Old habit. She hated that it was still there, hated that some part of her hadn't fully believed she was safe in this stable, even standing across from a man she'd once trusted with her life. "You gonna tell me what happened?" Rourke said. "Or am I supposed to guess?" "Depends," Agnes said. "You still on the level, Thaddeus? Or did this territory buy you same, as it bought the sheriff?" Something flickered across Rourke's face. Not anger. Something closer to hurt. "That's a hell of a thing to ask a man you haven't seen in this many years. It's a hell of a world we're standing in." For a long moment, the two of them just stared at each other across that dusty stable floor. Two old warhorses, both worn down by years neither one talked about, each one waiting to see which way the other would break. Eleanor watched them both, exhausted, wary, wondering if she'd traded one dangerous stranger's protection for another's. Rourke broke the silence first. "I've been in this territory 3 weeks, he said. Quiet like. Not wearing the badge, where folks could see it. Because something's rotten in Ironwood Flats, and I intend to find out exactly how deep it runs, before I make a single arrest." Rotten how? Ranchers going bankrupt, that had no business going bankrupt. Land changing hands quiet, through paperwork that don't quite add up, if you look close enough. Fires. Accidents. Men who used to own goods spread suddenly renting rooms above the saloon, drinking their pride away, because they've got nothing left to hold on to. Agnes's stomach tightened. "And every trail," Rourke went on, "every single one, leads back to the same man. Ash Grove." Rourke nodded slow. "Warwick Ash Grove." The name landed in that stable like a dropped stone in still water. Ripples going out in every direction, touching things Agnes had spent years trying to keep buried. Eleanor watched Agnes's face change. "Just slightly. Just enough." "You know him," Eleanor said. "Not a question." "I know his family." "That's not an answer." Agnes exhaled slow. Sat down heavy on an overturned crate, the exhaustion of the last day finally catching up to her all at once, the way it does, when a body's been running on nothing but adrenaline for too many hours straight. "Sit down," she said. "Both of you. This is gonna take a minute. Because here it is. The thing I never wanted to say out loud again. Except the girl's already in it up to her neck. Except Rourke already half knows, or he wouldn't be standing in a stable 3 weeks deep, into an investigation he's keeping off the books. So what's the point of holding onto it now? Old habits. That's the point. Old habits don't care whether they still make sense." Agnes rubbed her hands together slow, working feeling back, into fingers gone stiff, from a long night's ride. "A good many years back," she said, "there was a man named Silas Ash Grove. Warwick's father. Big cattle operation, bigger appetite. Wanted every acre of grazing land between here and the Sweetwater River, and he wasn't particular about how he got it." Eleanor leaned forward. "What happened?" "Same thing that's happening now, more or less. Small ranchers pushed off their land. Some by paperwork. Some by fire. A few just disappeared, and nobody asked too many questions, because asking questions around a man like that tended to be bad for a person's health." Rourke's jaw tightened. He'd clearly heard some version of this before, though not, Agnes suspected, the whole of it. "There was a community out near Sweetwater," Agnes continued. "Farmers. Ranch families. Good people, mostly, trying to hold onto what little they had. They hired protection. Somebody willing to stand between them and Ashgrove's men." "You," Eleanor said quietly. Agnes didn't answer right away. "I was younger then," she said finally. "Faster. And angrier than I've been in a long while since." A pause. There was a confrontation. Ended with Silas Ashgrove backing down. Losing men. Losing pride. Losing, worst of all for a man like that, control of a fight he thought he already owned. "And he never forgot it," Rourke said. "Men like that never do." Eleanor sat very still, piecing something together, her exhausted mind working slow, but working all the same. "Warwick," she said. "He would have been." "What?" "A boy, back then." 8 years old, Agnes said. "Maybe 9. Old enough to watch his father humiliated in front of every rancher in 3 counties. Old enough for it to sit in him, and rot, year after year, until it turned into something a whole lot uglier than grief. So this isn't about land." "It's about land," Agnes said. "And it's about land the way a house fire's about the match. There's more burning here than acreage, girl." Rourke's eyes had gone hard, thoughtful, a man rearranging every piece of an investigation he'd spent weeks assembling. "That's why he wants you," Rourke said slowly. "Not just because you're inconvenient. Because you're the one thing left in this territory that ever made his family look weak. And a man spends years waiting to fix that," Agnes said. "He doesn't fix it quiet. He fixes it loud. Public. Where everybody who remembers the old story gets to watch it happen." The stable went quiet a long moment. Dust drifting through a shaft of morning light angling in, through a gap in the roof boards. Somewhere outside, a train whistle sounded far off, mournful, indifferent to everything happening inside that old building. Eleanor finally spoke, voice small. "So what do we do?" Rourke looked at Agnes. Agnes looked back at him. Something passed between the two of them again, old trust, tested and battered by years apart, but not, it turned out, entirely broken. "We finish it," Rourke said. "The right way, this time. Not with a gunfight nobody walks away clean from. With proof. With witnesses. With every rancher Ashgrove's ruined standing in the street telling the truth in front of God and everybody." "That's a lot of ranchers to convince," Agnes said. "A lot of scared men who've spent years learning it's safer to keep their heads down." Then we go convince them. Eleanor pulled the coat tight around her shoulders, the coat, the one she'd risked everything for, the one with a torn seam, and empty lining, where proof had been sitting for weeks. He has the papers now, she said quietly. Dutch. Or whoever that man was. He took them out of the lining last night. I heard him find them. Rourke's face darkened. Then we're racing him to it. Whatever he's planning to do, with those papers, we need to move faster than he can carry them to Ash Grove's ranch. Because that's the trouble with proof, isn't it? It doesn't matter how true it is. Matters who's holding it, and who's standing behind them, when it finally sees daylight. Which means this isn't over. Not close to over. Except now it's not just a girl, and a tired old woman running, from 7 men. Now it's a marshal, and a town full of frightened ranchers, and a man, with years of hate stacked up behind his eyes, all of it converging on one street in one town, sooner rather than later. Agnes stood slow, joints protesting after a night that had asked far too much of a body her age. There's something else you should know, she said. About Dutch Malloy. Rourke frowned. The one leading Ash Grove's hired guns? He's not hired. Agnes's voice had gone quiet, careful, the way a person's voice goes, when they're picking their way across old, unstable ground. Or, he is now. But that's not where he started. Eleanor looked between them, confused. What do you mean? Agnes didn't answer right away. Something distant crossed her face, memory, unwelcome, arriving uninvited the way memory tends to, when a person spent a long time trying to keep a door shut on it. There was a fire, she said finally. Same year as everything else. Same trouble, same territory. A family caught in the middle of it, not fighters, not ranch hands, just people who happened to live too close to land Ash Grove's father wanted cleared. And? Rourke pressed. And there was a boy, Agnes said. Small. Younger than Eleanor is now, by a good margin. I got him out. Never learned what became of him, after, things got complicated fast, that year, and I had my hands full keeping other people breathing. The stable went very quiet. You think Dutch Malloy is, that boy, Eleanor said slowly. I think, Agnes said, that a man doesn't forget, who pulled him out of a burning barn. Whether he remembers my face or not is a different question entirely. But if I'm right, if that's who he is, then he's spent his whole life on the wrong side of this fight, without ever knowing it. Rourke exhaled long and slow. That's a thin thread to hang a plan on. It's the only thread I've got, Agnes said. Sometimes that has to be enough. Outside, Ironwood Flats had begun waking up in earnest. Wagon wheels creaking down the main road. A dog barking somewhere near the general store. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning, utterly unaware of the storm gathering at its edges. Eleanor stood, pulling her torn coat tighter, looking suddenly older than her 23 years. He's going to bring those papers straight to Ash Grove, she said. Isn't he? Dutch. Whatever he used to be, whoever that boy was, he's not that boy anymore. Not after everything he's done since. Maybe not, Agnes said. Maybe so. People surprise you. Sometimes for the worse. Sometimes, not as often as you'd like, but sometimes, for the better. And if he doesn't surprise us? If he hands those papers over exactly like he's planning to. Then Ash Grove finds out exactly what we know, Rourke said grimly. And exactly how much trouble he's actually in. Man like that, cornered, that's when he gets most dangerous. Agnes moved toward the stable doors, casting a long look out at the street beyond, at a town that had already decided, thanks to one printed poster, that she was the villain of whatever story was about to unfold. Then we don't give him time to feel cornered, she said. We move first. Move how? Eleanor asked. Agnes turned back to face them both, the young woman who'd trusted a stranger, with her life, without knowing why, and the old friend who'd spent 3 weeks alone chasing a truth too big for one badge to carry. "We find every rancher this man's ruined," Agnes said. "Every family who lost land, lost pride, lost somebody they loved to an accident, that wasn't really an accident at all. We get them standing together, in daylight, where the whole town can see them." "That's going to take time," Rourke said. "Time we may not have. Then we'd better start now." She stepped out of the stable, into the climbing morning sun, Eleanor close behind her, Rourke bringing up the rear, with one hand resting near his own weapon, eyes already scanning the street, with the practiced wariness of a man who'd spent 3 weeks learning exactly which shadows in this town could, and couldn't be trusted. Somewhere across the flats, Agnes knew, Dutch Malloy was riding hard toward Ash Grove's ranch, with a folded stack of papers tucked inside his coat, papers that could burn one man's empire to the ground, if they ever reached the right hands instead of the wrong ones. Somewhere behind that, 6 angry riders were nursing wounded pride, and worse, hunting for the old woman who'd made fools of every one of them in under a minute of gunfire and darkness. A 7th rode somewhere on his own, alone, chasing something he couldn't quite name. And somewhere ahead, in a ranch house Agnes remembered far better than she wanted to, a man was about to learn that the ghost his father had spent his whole childhood teaching him to hate hadn't died at all. She'd just been waiting. Same as always. Waiting for the moment it would matter most. That moment, Agnes understood now, standing in the growing light of a town that didn't yet know which way this story was going to break, that moment had just about arrived. They kept to the back streets a while longer, moving with purpose now instead of exhaustion, Rourke leading them toward a boarding house at the edge of town where, he explained low and quick, several families sat waiting who'd lost everything to Ash Grove's slow, patient cruelty over the last several years. "They're scared," Rourke warned. "Scared people don't always do the brave thing, even when it's sitting right in front of them." "I know," Agnes said. "Better than most." Eleanor walked between them, coat pulled tight despite the warming day, her mind clearly working, through everything she'd just learned, years of buried history, a boy pulled, from a fire, who might now be riding straight toward the man responsible for it, a legend she'd laughed about around a campfire not a full day earlier now walking silent, and grim at her side. "Agnes," she said quietly, as they turned down a narrow alley between 2 clapboard buildings. Back at the shack. When they were talking about you. The silver ghost." Eleanor hesitated. "Did any of it happen the way they said?" Agnes was quiet a long moment, boots crunching soft, overpacked dirt, morning light cutting long shadows across the alley walls. "Some of it," she said finally. "Most of it got bigger with every telling. That's what stories do, out here. They don't stay the size they started." "What's the true size?" Agnes almost smiled, tired and thin. "Smaller than the legend. Bigger than I'd like to admit some mornings." They reached the boarding house, as the sun cleared the rooftops fully, throwing the whole street into sharp, unforgiving light. Rourke knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more, some signal worked out, over 3 careful weeks of quiet investigation, and the door cracked open to reveal a weathered man somewhere past 50, eyes hollow with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd lost more than sleep. He looked at Rourke first. Then at Agnes. His whole body went still. "It can't be," he whispered. "It can," Agnes said quietly. "And it is. I need your help, Nathaniel Combs. Same as you once needed mine." The man's eyes filled, sudden and unashamed, the weight of years cracking loose all at once behind them. "We thought you were dead," he said. "Or gone. Or just, done with all of it." "I was done with it," Agnes said. "For years, I was done, with every bit of it." She looked past him, into the dim room beyond, where 2 more weary faces had turned toward the door, toward the sound of a name they'd apparently never stopped whispering in this town even, after the woman it belonged to had vanished entirely. Turns out done doesn't always stay done, Agnes said. Not when the same trouble comes back around wearing a different man's face. Inside, the room was small, close, thick with the smell of wood smoke, and old coffee. 3 ranchers sat around a battered table, Nathaniel Combs, and 2 others Rourke introduced quickly, as Whitfield and Osei, men who'd lost, between the 3 of them, close to 4,000 acres of good grazing land over the past few years. Each one had a story. Fires that started too conveniently. Water rights that vanished overnight, through paperwork nobody remembered signing. A brother, in Whitfield's case, who'd simply disappeared one autumn, and never been found, his land absorbed quietly, into Ash Grove's holdings, within the month. Agnes listened to each account without interrupting. Filed every detail away the way she'd filed away rifle counts, and nervous hands back at that lined shack, because details mattered, because details were the difference between a story people believed, and a story people dismissed, as an old woman's grudge. When they'd finished, the room fell quiet. "We've been afraid to speak up," Osei said finally, voice low, ashamed. "Every one of us. Afraid of what happens to a man who stands against Ash Grove in this territory." "I understand that fear," Agnes said. "I've carried plenty of it myself." "Then why come back at all?" Combs asked. "Why not stay gone? Stay safe?" Agnes looked toward the window, toward the street outside, where the town of Ironwood Flats carried on its ordinary business, utterly ignorant of the reckoning gathering quietly in a boarding house at its edge. "Because staying safe stopped feeling like living a long time ago," she said. "And because there's a girl standing behind me, who reminded me what it looks like to fight for something even, when you're scared out of your mind doing it." Eleanor's throat tightened at that. She hadn't expected to be the reason. Hadn't expected, a single day, into the worst stretch of her life, to matter to any of this beyond the papers sewn into her coat. "So," Rourke said, breaking the heavy silence, "will you stand with us? When the time comes. In the street, in daylight, where the whole town can see it." The 3 ranchers exchanged a long look between them, the look of men who'd spent years learning silence was safer, now being asked to trust that silence's time had finally run out. Combs spoke first. "If she's standing there too," he said, nodding toward Agnes, "then yes. God help us. Yes." Whitfield rubbed a hand across his jaw, thinking, then nodded slow. "My boy's been asking me for 2 years why we don't say anything. Never had a good answer for him. Might be time I gave him one." Osei was quiet longest of all. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. "My well's been dry 3 years. Every other well on that stretch runs fine. You want to know what that does to a man's pride, watching his neighbor's cattle drink, while his own go thirsty, and knowing exactly whose hand's behind it, and saying nothing all the same." He shook his head. "I'm done saying nothing." They left the boarding house, with 3 names added to whatever fragile alliance was being built in secret across Ironwood Flats, 3, out of what Rourke estimated could be a dozen, or more families who'd suffered the same slow ruin over the years. 12 wasn't enough on its own. 12, standing together in a town square, with the truth in their hands, and Marshal Rourke's badge behind them, might just be enough to matter. "We need more," Rourke said, as they walked, voice low, eyes constantly scanning rooftops, and alley mouths out of old habit. "And we need them fast. Once Dutch reaches Ash Grove, with those papers, he's going to know exactly how much danger he's standing in. Men like that don't wait around, when they're cornered. They come out swinging," Agnes said. "Or they run," Eleanor offered. "Ash Grove doesn't run," Agnes said quietly. "His father didn't either. Not until the very last second, and even then only, because I gave him no other choice. Because that's the trouble with old fights. They don't stay finished, no matter how deep you think you've buried them. Except this one's not really old, is it? This one's just been sleeping. Waiting. Growing up alongside a boy, who turned his grief into something colder and sharper than his father ever managed. And now it's awake again. And it's carrying more teeth than it used to. So what happens, if I'm not fast enough this time? What happens if the girl standing beside me pays for a debt her family never even knew they owed? Agnes pushed the thought down, hard, the way she'd learned to push down every unhelpful thought in the middle of a fight that wasn't finished yet. There'd be time for fear later. If there was a later. They spent the rest of the morning moving quietly, from house to house, farm to farm just outside town, Rourke's careful 3-week map of Ash Grove's victims finally put to full use. Some doors opened readily, old grief spilling out the moment they saw Agnes's face, and understood, somehow, without being told, exactly who stood on their porch. Others didn't open at all. Fear, in some folks, ran too deep for even an old legend's return to loosen its grip. One woman spoke to them only, through a cracked door, voice trembling, before finally shutting it soft, but final, and Eleanor felt the sting of that rejection nearly, as sharp as anything, from the day before. "She'll come around," Rourke said quietly, as they walked away. "Or she won't. Either way, it's not our place to make her." By early afternoon, they'd gathered 8 names willing to stand up. 8 families prepared to speak the truth out loud in a town square, in front of a sheriff, who answered to the very man they'd be accusing. It wasn't 12. It would have to be enough. "We move tomorrow," Rourke said, as the 3 of them finally paused to rest near the edge of the rail yard, shadows stretching long across the tracks, as the afternoon began sliding toward evening. "Give Ash Grove one more night to think he's still ahead of us. Give these families one more night to find their courage." "And Dutch," Eleanor said. "What about him? What if he's already handed those papers over?" Agnes looked out across the tracks, toward the direction of the Ash Grove ranch, miles distant but somehow, in that moment, feeling far too close. "Then tomorrow gets a great deal more dangerous," she said. "But it doesn't change what we do. Only how carefully we do it." Night fell over Ironwood Flats slow, and gold, then gray, then finally black, the same way it had fallen, over a line shack a full day earlier, though it felt, to Eleanor at least, like a lifetime had passed between the two. They took shelter in the loft above Rourke's rented stable space, a thin blanket spread, over old hay, the smell of horses, and dust settling around them like something almost peaceful. Eleanor lay awake a long while, staring up at gaps in the roof boards, where a few stars showed through. "Agnes," she said finally, into the dark. Tomorrow. If it goes wrong." "It might." Eleanor swallowed. "I'm scared." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft shuffle of horses below, and Rourke's steady, sleeping breath a few feet away. "Good," Agnes said finally. "Good. Man who isn't scared, before a fight like this isn't paying attention." A pause. "Fear's not the enemy, girl. Fear's just information. Questions what you do once you've got it." Eleanor turned that over in the dark a long moment. "What do you do with it?" she asked. "When you're scared?" "I get quiet," Agnes said. "Quiet, and careful, and I remember every single reason I've got left to keep breathing tomorrow morning." "What are your reasons?" "Tonight, I mean." Agnes was quiet, so long Eleanor thought she might not answer at all. "Used to be I didn't have any," Agnes said finally, voice low, almost gentle. "Used to ride, from place to place, with nothing much holding me anywhere. That's a lonely way to live, even when it's safe." Another pause, longer this time. "Tonight I've got a Marshal I thought I'd never see again." 8 families brave enough to stand up, after years of being told to stay quiet. And a stubborn girl, who kept touching a satchel she shouldn't have been touching, back on a road I never should have been driving down. Eleanor felt something warm rise up behind her eyes in the dark, unexpected, unbidden. "That's not much of a reason," she said, voice thick. "It's more than I had yesterday," Agnes said. "Some days, that's the whole trick of it. Finding one more reason than you had the day before." They lay quiet a while longer, the hay rustling faintly under them, the town outside settling into its own uneasy sleep. Agnes. Thank you. For coming back for the coat. For coming back for me. Get some sleep, girl. Tomorrow's going to want all the strength you've got left. Somewhere out beyond the edge of town, in a ranch house lit bright against the darkness, Dutch Malloy stood in a study lined with heavy oak shelves, holding out a folded stack of papers toward a man seated behind a wide desk. Warwick Ash Grove took them without a word. Unfolded them slow. Read every line twice, the same way Dutch had the night before, and when he finally looked up, his face carried none of the worry that had haunted Dutch's own features hours earlier. It carried something colder instead. Something patient. "She's alive, then," Ash Grove said quietly. "After all this time. Still breathing. Still meddling in business that isn't hers." "The old woman," Dutch said. "Yes. She's the one who got the girl out." Ash Grove set the papers down slow, deliberate, and looked out, through the window toward the dark shape of Ironwood Flats sitting low against the horizon. "My father used to tell me stories about her," he said. "Ghost stories. Meant to scare a boy into behaving." A thin, humorless smile. "I stopped being scared of ghosts a long time ago, Malloy. What do you want done?" Ash Grove turned back from the window, and whatever warmth had ever lived in his face seemed to drain out of it entirely, leaving behind something flat and final. "I want Ironwood Flats to remember exactly why my family's name still means something in this territory," he said. "And I want that old woman standing in the middle of the street when it happens." Dutch's stomach turned over, slow and cold, though he kept his face carefully still. Because something about the way Ash Grove said it, patient, almost gentle, like a man discussing supper plans instead of a reckoning years in the making, settled into Dutch's chest, and refused to leave. He didn't know yet, not fully, why the name Sweetwater kept surfacing in his memory like something half-remembered, from a dream. Didn't know yet why, staring at the folded papers now sitting on Ash Grove's desk, some small and stubborn part of him felt less like a hired gun, and more like a man standing on the wrong side of a fire he couldn't quite remember, but couldn't quite forget either. That knowledge was still coming. Tomorrow, in the bright unforgiving light of a town square, it would arrive all at once. And when it did, Dutch Malloy would have to decide, once and for all, which side of this old, bitter fight actually belonged to him. Morning came in flat and merciless. No clouds. No mercy in the light either, just that hard Wyoming sun climbing up over the rooftops of Ironwood Flats like it had a schedule to keep, and didn't much care what happened underneath it. Agnes stood at the mouth of the alley behind the boarding house, watching the street come awake. Wagon wheels. A dog barking somewhere. Somebody's rooster 3 houses down, hollering at a sun that had already been up an hour. Ordinary sounds. For one more hour, maybe 2, this town got to stay ordinary. Then it wouldn't. Because today's the day. Except saying that out loud makes it feel bigger than it should. Makes my hands want to shake, which they haven't done in years, not before a thing like this. So don't say it out loud. Just do it. Which is exactly what I told myself a long time ago. And that didn't go the way I planned either. Agnes pressed her palm flat against the rough wood of the alley wall. Steadied herself. 65 years old, and some mornings her body still forgot to ask permission, before it started aching in 6 different places at once. Eleanor came up beside her, coat buttoned tight despite the climbing heat, dark circles under her eyes, from a night that hadn't offered much sleep to anyone. "You look like you're about to be sick," Eleanor said. I look like a woman who's about to do something stupid, and knows it. That's comforting. Wasn't meant to be. Rourke joined them a minute later, badge pinned openly to his vest now, no longer bothering to hide it beneath a weeks-old disguise of quiet observation. 8 families, he said. All 8 said they'll be in the square by mid-morning. Whitfield's bringing his boy too. 15 years old. Watched his uncle disappear off their land a few years back. That's a lot to ask of a 15-year-old, Eleanor said. It's a lot to ask of anybody, Rourke said. Doesn't make it less necessary. Agnes looked at the two of them, the marshal who'd spent 3 careful weeks building a case nobody in town had the courage to hear, and the girl who'd carried a truth sewn into her coat lining for longer than either of them fully understood yet. Then we'd better not waste the courage they're bringing, Agnes said. Let's go. Word moved through Ironwood Flats the way word always moved, through small towns. Fast. Faster than anybody could control once it started, faster than Sheriff Otis Pruitt liked, judging by the look on his face, when he stepped out, onto the boardwalk around 9, that morning and found half his usual quiet Tuesday already gathering in knots along the street. Because somebody had talked. Because 8 families showing up in one place, on one morning, dressed like they meant business, drew eyes the way spilled blood draws flies. By 10 o'clock, a crowd had gathered near the railroad tracks. Not a mob. Not yet. Just curious townsfolk, shopkeepers standing in their doorways, a few ranch hands who'd ridden in for supplies, and found themselves caught up in something bigger than they'd planned their morning around. Pruitt watched it all, from his boardwalk, hands hooked in his belt, jaw working slow like a man chewing something he didn't much care for the taste of. Then a rider came in fast, from the east. Then another behind him. Then 5 more. Warwick Ash Grove rode into Ironwood Flats a little past 10:30, flanked by 6 armed men, Dutch Malloy among them, folded papers still tucked inside his coat, where they'd sat, since the night before. Ash Grove didn't look like his father. That was the thing Agnes noticed first, watching from the shadow of the general store's awning. Silas Ashgrove had been broad, loud, a man who filled a room by sheer volume alone. Warwick was narrower. Quieter. Wore his menace close to the skin instead of shouting it, from a distance, and somehow that made him worse. He reined his horse to a stop near the center of the street, right in front of the sheriff's office, and looked out, over the gathering crowd, with the calm, unhurried patience of a man who'd already decided how this morning was going to end. "Sheriff," Ashgrove said, voice carrying easy across the square. "Seems we've got some business to settle." Pruitt stepped down off the boardwalk, hand resting near his revolver. "Whatever you need, Mr. Ashgrove." "I need the woman who kidnapped Miss Vance." Ashgrove's eyes swept the crowd, slow, deliberate. "I understand she's somewhere in this town." Agnes stepped out from beneath the awning. The crowd's noise dropped to nothing all at once, like somebody had reached out, and turned the whole street's volume down to a whisper. Because there she was. Small. Gray-haired. 65 years old, and looking, to anyone who didn't know better, exactly like the harmless old woman a wanted poster had described. "No kidnapping happened," Agnes said, voice pitched to Carrie. "Your men took Eleanor Vance off a public road at gunpoint. I got her back. That's the whole of it." Ashgrove's expression didn't change. "That's not what the poster says. Posters lie plenty, when the man paying for the ink wants them to." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Not agreement, not yet. Just the sound of people paying closer attention than they had a minute earlier. Because this is the part where it usually goes wrong. Except it hasn't yet. Except the crowd's still listening, and listening's better than I had any right to hope for. So keep talking. Keep them listening. Which is easier said than done, when the man across from you has 6 armed guns, and a father's grudge sitting behind his eyes. Agnes kept her hands loose at her sides, kept her voice steady, kept every scrap of the fear crawling up her spine locked down tight, where nobody in that street could see it. "You want to talk about what's true," Agnes said. "Fine. Let's talk." She raised her voice, turned slightly, addressed the crowd instead of Ash Grove alone. 8 families in this territory lost their land these past few years. Fires. Accidents. Paperwork that got signed nobody remembers signing. Every single one of those losses fed straight into Ash Grove land holdings. "That's a serious accusation," Ash Grove said, calm as still water. "You have proof, or just an old woman's grudge?" "I have proof," Eleanor said, stepping out beside Agnes, coat torn open at the seam, where paper used to sit hidden. "Except your man there took it off me last night." Every eye in the square swung toward Dutch Malloy. Dutch sat his horse rigid, papers a dead weight inside his coat, the whole crowd's attention landing on him like a hand closing around his throat. He looked at Ash Grove. Ash Grove looked back, calm, expectant, the look of a man who assumed loyalty was simply owed to him, purchased fair and square, with a paycheck. "Give the papers to the sheriff," Ash Grove said. "Let's clear this up properly." Dutch didn't move. "Malloy." Ash Grove's voice sharpened, just slightly. "The papers. Because here it is. Except I don't even know why my hands won't move. Which doesn't make sense. I work for the man. Papers are his business now, not mine. So why does handing them over feel like handing over something I'm not allowed to give away?" Dutch's fingers brushed the folded edge of paper inside his coat. Stayed there. Didn't pull it free. Because something had been nagging at him, since the night before, some scrap of memory sitting just out of reach, stubborn, refusing to surface fully no matter how hard he chased it. A fire. A barn. Smoke thick enough to choke a person's throat raw. Small hands. His hands, though they hadn't been a man's hands then. A woman's arms around him, carrying him out, through flame and collapsing timber, into cold night air. He'd been young. Younger than young. Barely old enough to remember his own name, let alone the face of whoever pulled him free that night. But he remembered the voice. Low. Steady. Telling him, over and over, "Hold on, boy, hold on, I've got you," the same low, steady voice that had just spent the last 5 minutes standing in the middle of this street telling an entire town the truth, while 6 armed men stared her down. "Malloy," Ash Grove said again, sharper now. "I won't ask a third time." Dutch's eyes found Agnes across the square. Really looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her back at the line shack, dismissive, unbothered, an old woman not worth tying up. Looked at her the way a man looks at something he spent his whole life failing to recognize. "Sweetwater," Dutch said, low, almost to himself. "There was a fire near Sweetwater." Agnes went very still. "Years back," Dutch went on, voice unsteady now, cracking around the edges. "A family. A barn. He stopped. Started again. I was maybe 4 years old. My folks didn't make it out. Somebody did pull me out, though. Somebody I never got a name for." The whole square had gone silent, waiting, the tension stretched thin as wire. "Was that you?" Dutch said, staring straight at Agnes. "Was that you, who pulled me out of that fire?" Agnes's throat tightened. Years of pretending, that night hadn't happened, and here it stood, grown up and armed, and working for the very family responsible for lighting that match in the first place. "Yes," she said quietly. "That was me." Something broke open across Dutch Malloy's face, grief, confusion, something close to fury, all of it arriving at once, and none of it aimed clearly enough, yet to know where it belonged. He looked at Ash Grove. Looked at the man he'd ridden with for years, taken orders from, killed for on more than one occasion he didn't much like remembering. Your father, Dutch said slowly. Your father's men burned that barn. Ash Grove's calm cracked, just barely, just at the corners. That's ancient history, Malloy. Doesn't concern you. It concerns me plenty, Dutch said, voice rising now, seeing as I was inside it. Because there it is. Except years of careful distance just cracked wide open in the middle of a public street. Which means everything's about to move faster than any of us planned for. So hold steady. Whatever happens next, hold steady. Ash Grove's hand drifted toward his own weapon, slow, deliberate. This doesn't need to get complicated. It got complicated the night your father burned my family alive, Dutch said. He reached into his coat, not for a gun. For the folded papers, still sitting exactly where he'd tucked them the night before. He held them up. High. Where the whole crowd could see. These are real, Dutch said. Every word of it. I read them myself last night, before I ever handed them over. The crowd's murmur turned into something louder. Sharper. A dozen conversations breaking out at once, ranchers turning to their neighbors, faces tight with a mixture of vindication and fear. Ash Grove's composure slipped fully now, the calm patience of moments earlier giving way to something colder underneath. Give me the papers, Malloy. No. One word. Flat. Final. Ash Grove's hand closed fully around his revolver. That was when the 8 families stepped forward. Whitfield first, his 15-year-old son gripping his sleeve. Then Combs, and Osei, and 5 more. Agnes had spent the last day and a half convincing, one hard conversation at a time, that silence had cost them enough already. They didn't carry weapons. They carried something Ash Grove hadn't planned for at all. Witnesses. My brother didn't run off, Whitfield said, voice carrying loud and clear across the square. You know that, Ash Grove. Everybody standing here today knows that. My well went dry 3 days, after I refused to sell, Osei said. Been dry ever since. Funny thing, considering every other well on that stretch still runs fine. You burned my barn to the ground, and called it lightning, Combs said, voice shaking with years of held-back anger finally spilling free. Wasn't a cloud in the sky, that whole week, and everybody here knows that too. One by one, they spoke. Short. Simple. No embellishment needed, because the plain truth, laid out flat in front of a whole town, carried more weight than any story ever could. Ash Grove's grip tightened on his revolver. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cool morning, and something in his eyes, something Agnes recognized, from years back, from a different Ash Grove standing in a different clearing, began to slip. Cornered men did one of 2 things. They folded. Or they got dangerous. Because his father did the second one. I remember that clear as anything. Except I'm years older now, and my hands don't move the way they used to. Which doesn't matter. Which can't matter. Not today. So steady. Just steady. 1 more minute of steady. Agnes stepped forward, slow, deliberate, placing herself between Ash Grove's rising temper, and the crowd of families still speaking their truth, into the open air. It's over, Warwick, she said quietly. Just for him. Whatever you're about to do next, it doesn't undo what everybody in this street just heard. Doesn't put those families' land back either. You don't get to lecture me, Ash Grove said, voice shaking now, years of carefully constructed calm finally giving way. You took everything from my father. Humiliated him in front of this whole territory. Your father humiliated himself, Agnes said. I just refused to let him burn one more family alive to do it. His hand moved. Fast, faster than a man his age should have managed, revolver clearing leather in one smooth motion, that told Agnes, in the half-second she had to process it, that Warwick Ash Grove had spent considerable time practicing exactly this moment. She'd expected it. That was the difference between them. Her own hand moved a fraction of a second behind his, old muscle memory rising up out of years of rust like it had never left at all, and the two shots, that cracked across Ironwood Flats Main Street landed almost on top of each other. Almost. Ashgrove's shot went wide. Agnes's didn't. He staggered back a step, revolver falling from fingers gone suddenly nerveless, a dark stain spreading fast across his shoulder, where her bullet had found exactly the spot she'd aimed for, not his heart, not his head. His shoulder. Because there'd been enough killing in this story already, and Agnes Calhoun had decided, somewhere in the long dark hours of the night before, that this morning wasn't going to add to that count if she had any say in the matter. Ash Grove went down hard, onto the dusty street, gasping, clutching at the wound, and for the first time in all his years of carrying his father's grudge, the fear that had been sitting behind his family's name finally showed plain, and unguarded on his face. The square exploded into motion. Rourke moved fast, badge catching the sun, revolver drawn and leveled at the 6 riders who'd come in, with Ash Grove, voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Nobody else draws a weapon. I am a United States Marshal, and every man here is under arrest, unless he drops his gun in the next 5 seconds. Guns hit the dirt. All 6 of them, one after another, the fight going out of men who'd only ever been dangerous, when the odds sat comfortably in their favor. Dutch dropped his own weapon last. Stood there in the street, papers still clutched tight in one fist, staring down at the man he'd worked for, the man whose family had burned his own to nothing years back. Agnes stood a moment longer, revolver still loose in her hand, the recoil settling slow, into the muscles of her arm the way it always did, an old familiar ache she hadn't felt this sharp in a long, long while. Not a wound. Just the memory of one, living in her shoulder the way memory tends to live in the parts of a body, that did the remembering hardest. You could have killed him, Dutch said quietly, walking over to where Agnes stood, still catching her breath, hands trembling now, that the moment had finally passed. Could have, Agnes agreed. Didn't. Why not? Agnes looked down at Ash Grove, groaning in the dirt, sheriff's deputies finally moving in now, that the danger had passed to bind his wound, and his hands both. Because killing him doesn't give those families their land back, she said. And because I spent a long time running, from what I did the last time I let a fight end that way. Wasn't interested in running another stretch that long. Dutch looked down at the papers in his hand. Turned them over slow. These are yours now, I suppose, he said, holding them out toward Rourke. Or the Marshal's. Or, I don't rightly know, whose they're supposed to be anymore. They belong to the families, whose names are on them, Eleanor said, stepping forward, taking the papers gently, from his hand. And they belong in a courtroom, where a judge can put things right. Dutch nodded slow. Something in his shoulders finally loosened, years of carrying a grudge he hadn't even understood the shape of, until this morning. I'm not proud of what I've done, he said, looking at Agnes. Riding with men like this. Doing the things they asked. No, Agnes said. I don't imagine you are. Does that matter now? After everything? Agnes studied him a long moment, the boy she'd pulled out of a fire, grown into a man who'd spent his whole life on the wrong side of a war he never chose, standing here now having finally, at the very last possible second, chosen right. It matters, she said. Questions what you do with it from here. Sheriff Pruitt, standing at the edge of the square throughout the entire confrontation, found himself suddenly very interested in his own boots, as Rourke turned toward him next. You've got some explaining to do too, Rourke said. Starting with why a wanted poster went up naming an innocent woman a kidnapper less than a day after the actual crime happened. Pruitt's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I was following procedure, he managed. Following orders, Rourke corrected. There's a difference, and every soul standing in this street just watched you fail to understand it. The crowd, silent through most of the confrontation, found its voice again now, not the sharp murmur of moments earlier, but something steadier. Something that sounded, to Agnes's tired ears, almost like relief. Near the back of the gathered crowd, a rider Agnes hadn't expected to see again sat quiet on his horse, hat pulled low. Amos Teller. He hadn't come with Ash Grove's men. Hadn't announced himself at all, in fact, until the moment the guns went down, and the truth finished spilling out, into the open street. He rode forward slow, dismounted, and stood a careful distance from Agnes, hat in his hands now, looking a good deal older than his years. "I should have said something a long time ago," he said, voice rough. "About the fire. About what really happened out at Sweetwater. I was there. I saw what your father's men did, Ash Grove, and I never once told a soul, because I was scared, and because staying quiet paid better than telling the truth ever did." He looked at Agnes. "You could have left me on that trail last night. Would have been easier." "Wasn't looking for easier," Agnes said. "Was looking for right." "Guess I owe you twice, over now," Amos said. "Once for that night at the fire. Once for last night." "Then pay it forward," Agnes said. "Stand with these families, when the circuit judge comes through. That'll square it plenty." Amos nodded, slow, something like relief loosening the tight line of his shoulders, and stepped back to stand among the gathered witnesses, one more voice added to a chorus that had been silent far too long. The rest of that day moved slow and strange, the way days do, after violence finally breaks, and the world has to figure out how to keep turning regardless. Ash Grove got carried to the town doctor, wound cleaned and bound, a deputy posted at his door not for his protection, but to make certain he didn't disappear, before Rourke's investigation reached its proper end. The papers went into Rourke's official custody, copied twice over by the town clerk, before the day was through, insurance against any convenient fire that might otherwise befall them. And the 8 families, 9, counting Dutch's own tangled, complicated place among them now, 10 counting Amos Teller's quiet return, stood together in the square long, after the danger had passed, talking in low voices about land, about lawyers, about a future, that had, for the first time in years, started to look like it might actually belong to them again. Agnes sat on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, as evening settled gold, and soft over Ironwood Flats, the whole long exhausting day finally catching up with her all at once. Eleanor sat down beside her. "Quiet a moment. You saved my life twice," Eleanor said finally. "Once on that road. Once just now, in the street." "You gave me a reason to," Agnes said. "That satchel of yours. That fussing you couldn't quite stop yourself from doing. I thought you were judging me for it." "I was counting on it," Agnes said, and something warm flickered behind her tired eyes. "Told you back then. Details matter. Because here's the thing I never expected, sitting on a boardwalk at 65 years old, with an old ache settling into my arm and a shot that landed exactly where I meant it to. Except this doesn't feel like the ending I always imagined for myself. Which was riding off alone. Same as I always did. Same as I told myself I'd keep doing, until there wasn't any road left to ride. So maybe that's not how this story ends after all." Eleanor looked over at her, something thoughtful crossing her face. "What happens now?" she asked. "For you, I mean. Now that the whole territory knows the silver ghost is real, and old, and apparently still faster than a man half her age." Agnes almost laughed. "Suppose I'll have to find someplace new to hide. Or," Eleanor said carefully, "you could stay." "Stay. My family's land, what's left of it, once the courts sort everything out, it's a good spread. Need somebody who knows how to run it. Knows how to protect it, too, if it ever comes to that again." Eleanor hesitated. "I could use the help. And, if I'm honest, I could use the company." Agnes sat with that a long moment, watching the last light drain gold out of the sky, over Ironwood Flats, watching a town slowly settle back into its ordinary evening rhythms, after a morning that had asked so much of everybody standing in it. For years, she'd spent moving. Never staying anywhere long enough to be found, long enough to be known, long enough for anybody to matter enough, that losing them would cost her something real. That kind of life kept a person safe. It also kept a person alone. "I'm an old woman, girl," Agnes said finally. "Set in my ways. Ornery on a good day. I noticed. Might not be the easiest company to keep." "I didn't say easy," Eleanor said. "I said good." Agnes looked at her a long moment. Then, slow, something shifted in her weathered face, not quite a smile, not yet, but close enough to its neighborhood, that Eleanor recognized it for what it was. "All right," Agnes said quietly. "All right? All right. I'll stay. Try it, anyhow. See how long an old ghost and a stubborn girl can stand sharing the same roof, before one of us drives the other clean out of her mind." Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, the first one in 2 days, that didn't carry fear underneath it, and for a moment, sitting there on that worn boardwalk, as the last of the day's light faded out over the Wyoming plains, it almost felt like the whole hard business of the last 48 hours had happened to somebody else entirely. A few weeks later, the courts finished their slow, careful work. Land got returned, deed by deed, to families who'd spent years believing it gone for good. Warwick Ash Grove stood trial in a courtroom 2 counties over, and though his money bought him a lighter sentence than some folks in Ironwood Flats felt he deserved, it didn't buy him back the empire his father had spent a lifetime building, through fear and quiet cruelty. Sheriff Pruitt didn't survive the scandal. Resigned quiet, left town within the month, and nobody much minded seeing him go. Dutch Malloy testified at every hearing the court required of him. Told the truth, plain and complete, about every job he'd ever ridden on Ash Grove's payroll. It cost him a short stretch of consequence for his own part in things, a debt he paid, without complaint, understanding better than most, that a man doesn't get to choose the family he's born to, but he does get to choose, eventually, which side of a fight he finally stands on. He came to visit the Vance ranch sometimes, after. Never stayed long. But he came, and each time he did, something in him seemed a little lighter than the time before. Amos Teller came, with him, once or twice, standing a little apart, still quiet, still carrying the weight of years spent looking away, but standing there all the same, which counted for something. As for Agnes Calhoun, she stayed exactly where she'd said she would. The ranch needed work, fences mended, cattle counted, 100 small chores, that came with running good land properly, and she took to it the way she took to everything, quiet and steady and unshowy, the same careful patience, that had once made her the most feared name whispered around outlaw campfires now spent teaching a stubborn 23-year-old how to read a length of fence line for trouble, before trouble ever arrived. Some evenings, sitting on the porch, as the sun went down gold, over land that finally, truly, belonged to the people who'd worked it, Eleanor would catch Agnes looking out toward the horizon, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to relief. The particular relief of a woman who'd spent a long stretch of her life preparing for a goodbye that, this time, finally, impossibly, never had to come. One evening, well into autumn, Eleanor finally asked the question she'd been holding onto since the creek at sunrise, weeks and weeks earlier. "The coat," she said. "You never asked what was really in it. Not the land papers. The other thing. The reason I couldn't stop touching that satchel the whole first day." Agnes glanced sideways at her. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "It was a letter," Eleanor said quietly. "From my mother. Written the week before she died. I've carried it in every coat I've owned since, sewn into the lining, so I'd never lose it, never have it taken. When Dutch found the land papers, I was terrified he'd find that too. That's the flicker you kept catching on my face. Wasn't the deeds I was scared of losing. It was her. Agnes was quiet a long moment. Some things matter more than land, she said finally. Man like Ashgrove never did understand that. Spent his whole life chasing acreage, and never once figured out what was actually worth protecting. And you, Eleanor said. What did you spend your whole life chasing? Agnes looked out at the darkening horizon, weathered hands folded loose in her lap, the ache in her shoulder long, since faded to nothing more than memory. For a long time, she said, nothing at all. Just distance. Just the next mile, and the one after that. She glanced at Eleanor, something soft crossing her face. Guess I finally found something worth stopping for. Because that's the thing about legends, if a person stops to think it through long enough. They don't stay legends forever. Not really. Sooner or later, if a person's lucky, the legend gets to just be a person again. Gets to sit on a porch. Gets to watch a young woman she came to care for grow steadier, braver, more herself with every passing season. Gets to stop running. That's not nothing, friend. That might be the whole point, if you ask an old woman, who spent most of her life believing otherwise. If there's a lesson worth carrying home, from a story like this one, maybe it's this: your past can chase you a long, long way down a lot of lonely roads. But it doesn't get the final word. Not unless you let it. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't drawing a weapon fast, or standing tall in a dangerous street. Sometimes it's simpler than that. Sometimes it's just staying long enough to let somebody in. Until next time, friend. Take care of yourself out there. And when life hands you one more chance to stop running, be brave enough to take it. This story is a work of fiction. Its characters, names, and events are entirely invented, drawing loosely on the atmosphere and folklore of the American frontier rather than on any real people, families, or documented history. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.